Beauveria Mordicana. This is the official title of the Spore Carriers, the fungal controlled corpses that are first encountered in Fallout New Vegas. For many of us, the first exposure to these killer greens was inside Vault 22, which I have covered in a previous video, so if you're here looking for details on it, please consult that video. However, while they are first discovered inside Vault 22, that is not where they originated from, and it is not the last place where they spread to. Indeed, they can be found in two other DLCs, Zion Canyon and Big MT, both of which help to fill in the blanks. So let's get started on unraveling the past of these strange creatures and the spore that controls them. Their origin, like so many of the fucked up things in Fallout New Vegas, begins in Big MT, surprise fucking surprise. Specifically the X-22 Botanical Gardens. Oddly enough, they bear the same name as a vault that the contents of this centre ended up ruining. Within the walls of this rundown military research base, we find the results of researching the military application of plants. Patient 0, the first individual infected with Beauveria Mordicana. This also gives us an example of how long individuals infected can survive, as this happened even before the outbreak in Vault 22, meaning it is over 2 centuries old and it's still fucking alive. Or at least it was, until it tried to rustle our jimmies. So this spore was developed here for military applications, and then later transferred to Vault 22, supposedly. The question is, why was it transferred and for what purpose was it developed? Well, first of all, we need to look at what the spore actually is in nature. Inside Vault 22, one of the terminals talking about the residents being infected refers to it as an entomopathogenic fungus. This is a fungus that acts as a parasite and can damage or kill insects exposed to them, though in this case it has been engineered to target people. One type you'll be familiar with are Cordyceps, which can infect a host and control their body. One can cause ants to climb a plant or a high place before they die, so the spores that sprout after can grow and spread in the optimum conditions. If you are wondering why this sounds familiar, a mutated strain of Cordyceps was the fungus featured in The Last of Us. All this information falls in line with what we can find out about the spore in Vault 22. The entry on Beauveria Mordicana identifies it as an entomopathogenic fungus, and gives us some insight into what the purpose may have been. They say it colonizes pest bodies, and that, when fully colonized, the host dies. However, the fungus can reanimate the body and spread more spores among other members of its host species. It even tells us what the incubation period is, roughly 10 to 20 days. Which would mean it would be highly effective, as the other members of the species may not notice that one of them has been infected until they spent too much time around them and contracted the spores themselves. The effectiveness of this incubation period is mostly seen inside Vault 22, as many people succumb to the spore. When people are infected, they seem to exhibit symptoms such as chills, a fever, and a racking cough. These are all signs that the body is trying to fight off an infection. This is our first hint that the spore infection begins inside the host, as when they're unsure what was going wrong, as no external symptoms were present, they cut open one of the victims. The spores were found in the lungs, which may mean the host dies from suffocation or an oxygen-related symptom, and then the spores take over. After that, the corpses reanimate shortly after. Here is where the actual application may have come in. As we know, many of the inhabitants of Vault 22 left after the spore was introduced to the air. Now, since it was first created inside Big MT, the question is this: was the intention of this vault to test how well the spore would spread or not? They state it was used for pest control only, yet it somehow made its way into the ventilation system, and several terminal entries inside the vault state this. If it is the case, then they were most likely testing to see how well the spore would affect people in a small area, similar to a building. However, it spread too well, all the way to Zion Valley in fact. On the terminal entries of Randall Clark, hardest of cunts, blessed be his name, he talks about the residents of Vault 22. At this point, they seem to be a bunch of murderous, marauding assholes. He states that many of them had racking coughs, similar to what we know of in Vault 22. This means that many of them were infected, but the spores were still incubating, meaning it took them about 3 weeks to get to Zion Valley. The spores most likely spread through the group slowly in the open air, as 10 months have gone by before Randall says all the coughers are gone, and people originally infected would not have lasted this long. He also states that they ate their captives. I am not sure if this was a result of the influence of the spores, or they were just beyond hope at that point. but it's fucked up either way. Now before we go any further, let's have a look at them. The Spore Carrier are an ugly bunch. Their skin is covered in a layer of what the terminals in Vault 22 state is lichen. White patches dot the skin, and parts are swollen out or sunken in, possibly due to a slight decay. The fingers and toes seem to have hardened and elongated, and they have lost one of each, on each hand and foot. They possess several leaf-like protrusions on their back, which allow them to blend into their surroundings, as most of them burrow slightly into soil to mask their presence, hiding among plants and grass. These protrusions may also contain more spores, as they can explode if they are not killed quickly enough. Their faces are completely fucking frigged as well, with the areas around the eyes and ears completely crusted over or sunken in. Begging the question, how do they sense things? It may have something to do with the protrusions on their backs, similar to the tunnelers. Their teeth are the creepiest part of them. The lips seem to be completely gone, and the blood-red gums are the only thing that remain, with their way too human-looking teeth, ready to sink into your arse. They walk on all fours, which may be the result of the protrusions damaging the spine, and large periods of inactivity weakening the leg and arm muscles to the point this is the only way they can move. If the goal of Vault 22 was to test how well the spore created in X-22 performed on a human population, then it most certainly failed. Inside the vault, where it could be pumped out in the only source of breathable air, and the inhabitants had a limited space to move to, it was very effective. But out in the open, with fresh air and large spaces, not so much. Roughly over 100 Vault 22 residents came to Zion. Now all of them were not infected at that time, but it still took more than 10 months for the spore to kill about 70% of them, and some of this number were probably killed by Randall. So in terms of effectiveness, it would never have worked as a weapon in real warfare, apart from in a small enclosed space, such as a military base, and even then it would have taken weeks. So while it did spread across a large region, its effectiveness within a stationary group over a short period of time may not be that high. Now the purpose of Vault 22 was also to grow vegetation, and there is quite a large amount of it. In Zion Valley, vegetation can be found near the Spore Carriers. Anywhere they are present, vegetation blooms. Now the question has to be raised, is that because of them? Does their presence help plants grow? They use them to hide themselves from prey, so it would be in their best interest. Perhaps they have developed a way to increase the growth of vegetation, either through unknown means, or perhaps as a consequence of their spores they emit. Now why they are not the topic of this video, the spore plants do need to be touched on. They have been around without the spore carriers before, such as in Vault 2, and in the Fallout Bible it has been suggested that they are the result of FEV. One even developed intelligence, a plant named Seymour. So while they are not a product of the spore carriers, it is interesting to note they do seem to grow better in their presence, which would suggest the spore carriers do have some effect on the vegetation surrounding them. The last thing I want to talk about are some of the finer points of the spores. On the expedition logs inside Vault 22, Katie points out that lichen, and by extension the spores, do not seem to be contagious to her. Now this makes sense as she is a ghoul. Her internals may not be compatible with the spores, as they were engineered to affect ordinary people. So the parasites either ignore ghouls as a host, or they simply cannot survive inside their flesh. Lastly, I want to talk about the runts. Given both their names and their size, it's clear that these are some of the children that inhabited Vault 22. It's significant because it's one of the few times that you get to see how some of the horrors of the waste affected children, and one of the few times that you can actually kill them. Some are even found with 2 other adult spore carriers, so you could argue that familial bonds may remain between the parents and the child even after all this time. These creatures help to really drive home the horror of this spore, and what it did to the inhabitants of the vault. A spore designed for what? Pest control? Biological warfare? Even after all this, I'm still unsure. Was it spread on purpose inside Vault 22, or was it an accident? Big MT must have known that it wouldn't be feasible as a weapon, based on what we've found out here, and yet it was there anyway. Perhaps it was a mistake, and they were never meant to be in the vault. But the spores would change the people of Vault 22 into cannibals, or was that their own doing? We have seen the worst of people before, so I think it was their own choice. Does the spore pose a threat to the Mojave? No, I don't think so. Even in Vault 22, they described it as ineffective on unsocial pests. Well, people are unsocial now, and even a large group that was in contact with each other for months, it never seemed to have much of an effect. It barely killed over 60%. But it still provided us with some of the strangest and most gruesome creatures we encounter in the Mojave. Creatures that, after centuries of being puppets to the spore, we finally laid to rest. A strange creature with an uncertain past, one I hope you enjoyed me shedding a little light on. If you want to see more of my content, check out my playlists to see if there are any more questions on Fallout that you have, and I may have answered. Any support in spreading the word of this channel is greatly appreciated, as Fallout 4 is just around the corner. If you want to support me and get regular updates, subscribe. Any suggestions or feedback for the episode should be left either in the comments below or on my subreddit, which is linked in the description. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook to get regular channel updates and to talk to me or have a wee chat. If you want to get in contact with me regarding business, message me here on YouTube or on my Twitter, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. I hope you did enjoy this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, goodbye.